Born to be free, a short Dvar Torah for Parashat Mishpatim. Parashat Mishpatim is different from its counterparts in Sefer Shmot. Instead of the stories we've grown accustomed to up to this parasha, or the laws that deal with a common theme beginning from next week's, the portion of Mishpatim deals with a variety of details that the people of Israel need to know to live their communal life, even if there's no direct link between subject and subject. Ibn Ezra opens his commentary on the parasha stating as much, though he immediately qualifies his words and says, there is a kind of support for the link between the verses that a person should not commit violence or coerce one who is weaker than him in ability. Nevertheless, many commentators have tried to give an overall meaning to the order of things, so it would be impolite to completely ignore them. Therefore, I decided to refer only to the first law in the parasha, thus avoiding the need to take a stand on this issue. The commentators have examined the first clause of the parasha, the laws of the Hebrew slave, from many directions. To give just a few examples, I'll detail some commentators who chose to comment on the Torah opening the social laws with the laws of the Hebrew slave, such as the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who attributed it to Moshe reminding Hashem not to send the children of Israel into exile because the nations will not release them after 6 years. Nachmanides and many others who connect the law to the Ten Commandments and claim that just as the Ten Commandments open with I am Hashem your Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage or slavery, so the first law begins with the law of the release of the Hebrew slave. And Abarbanel, who compares it specifically to you shall not murder, because a master who does not care for his slaves is like one who murders them while they are still alive. Now that I have done what I said I would not do and discussed the location of the laws of the Hebrew slave, I feel ready to move on to review the phenomenon of slavery as appearing in Tanakh. The first reference to slavery comes immediately after the flood. Noach, who saw the world destroyed, drowns his sorrow in wine. His son Ham ignores his emotional distress and, instead of offering assistance, disgraces his father. His two brothers honor their father and cover him, and when Noach hears what happened, he curses Ham's son Canaan, that he will be a slave of slaves to his brothers. The effectiveness of this curse is doubtful, however. In the very next chapter, the descendants of Canaan have families, borders, and lands which do not characterize slaves generally. The next slaves to be explicitly mentioned, and not, for example, the soul that they have made in Haran, are the male and female slaves that Avraham takes from Paro in exchange for Sarai. Although at first glance these slaves and maidservants have no significant role, I think they pave the way for the treatment of an important maidservant in Bereshit Tetzain and an important slave in Bereshit Kaf Dalet. The important maidservant is, of course, Hagar. The very fact that she has a name is surprising. Why? Because she's an Egyptian maidservant, meaning one of those Avram takes from Egypt. In Egypt, even noblewomen don't have a name or rights, as viewed from the story of Sarai in Egypt. Among the innovations taught regarding maidservants in this story are that a maidservant also has a personality, she has a name, she has thoughts about the world, her mistress was belittled in her eyes, and when mistreated, she's offended, and she fled from her. She too was created in the image of God, she speaks to an angel, and she is capable of expressing a degree of ownership over certain things, as she can name a place. She remains a maidservant, but maidservants are people too, aren't they? Next is Avraham's slave, who is sent to find a wife for Yitzchak. The sages give him a name as well, Eliezer, because they too learn from chapter Tetzain that slaves have names, but the Torah chooses to ignore his name. Why? I'll get to that shortly, but first, I want to note some other things the story can teach about slaves. He's responsible, ruler over all that Avraham has. He's independent, sent alone on an important mission. He exercises judgment, and what if the woman is not willing to come with me? He has a relationship with Hashem, God of my master Avraham, and perhaps most significantly, when necessary, he knows how to present himself to the world as not a slave, but a man. Why, if so, does he have no name? I think that this is to show that this slave is not unique in Avraham's world. He's just another one of the slaves. Well, yeah, he is master of his slaves, but he doesn't have a name because these are the slaves that Avraham teaches to do the bidding of Hashem, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. One could also refer to Avraham and Yaakov's slave who endanger their lives in the wars of their master's household, saving Lot in the meeting with Esav, or to Yitzchak's slaves who dig wells but there's no source where they were purchased. But I want to have some time to refer also to the Hebrew slaves with which we opened. The first Hebrew who is sold into slavery is Yosef, who's sold to Egypt. Even if we ignore many details in the story of Yosef's sale or the years of enslavement, such as the incident that led to this sale, the lack of clarity arising from the verses regarding the identity of the sellers and more, there is a lot to learn from the story, this time not as masters of slaves, but as slaves themselves. Yosef does not allow being sold into slavery affect how he perceives himself. Yosef is not a slave at no point in the story, except for when people are trying to belittle him. Only Eshet Adonav, his master's wife, or Sarah Mashkim, will call him a slave. Throughout the entire story, he is only Yosef. This is not to be taken lightly. Yosef's story is full of slaves. Yosef has slaves, Paro has slaves, the brothers are slaves. There is slavery, but Yosef himself will not fall to slavery. Yosef himself perceives himself as free. And in my opinion, this is the key innovation that Yosef enables in the slave's status. Avraham's slaves were treated very well, and their humanity was strongly emphasized, but they did not know how to leverage things and get their freedom. Only Yosef, who remains free in spirit, could do that. This is a spirit by which Yosef will be the one to tell the children of Israel, God will surely visit you and take you out of Egypt, the message with which Moshe will come to the children of Israel and free them. Pakod pakadeti, pakod efkod. This is the spirit that will allow the slaves to share in the Shabbat rest and the Ten Commandments, and by this spirit, the Hebrew slave will be set free on the 7th year. In blessed memory of my beloved student, Amichai Shimon Hashem Yikom Damo, son of Batya and Yishai Rubin. Jovi Holtz, one who loves freedom and Tanakh.